Hello and welcome to Series 3 of the Borne Podcast, the podcast that brings you stories of research, resilience and real-life experiences of pregnancy and preterm birth. I'm Ellie Gibson.
And I'm Caro.
And I'm Mark Johnson. As an obstetrician, I've seen the devastating effects of preterm birth, how challenging it can be for families who are going through that, and the extraordinary strength shown by parents. And I believe, because I'm a scientist, in the progress that can be made through research. And it is that belief that led me to found Borne in 2013, to better understand pregnancy, to find ways to prevent preterm birth before it begins.
At Borne, our aim is to prevent preterm birth, giving every baby the best possible start in life. We fund pioneering research to deepen our understanding of pregnancy and childbirth, research that brings us closer to answers and realising our aim to prevent preterm birth.
In this podcast, we bring together parents, experts and scientists to share their stories with honesty and compassion. We talk about the science, but we also talk about hope, heartbreak, courage and the small victories that mean everything. Because every insight, every conversation and every breakthrough moves us towards a future where more babies can arrive safely at the right time.
Today we welcome Baroness Bertin to the Borne Pod. Thank you, Gabby, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're most welcome. Gabby set up the Preterm birth inquiry in the House of Lords, which goes, we'll just head straight in, Gabby, if we can. Why did you want to set up this inquiry?
Firstly, to sort of be completely open about it, I was first introduced to Borne via the amazing Professor Mark Johnson, who delivered my third baby. And I can remember talking to him a lot about some of the work that he does, particularly with women who have had several or are struggling to keep babies full term. And I knew several friends who had had this terrible tragedy happen to them. And I also, myself had a miscarriage at a much earlier stage, but still that fear of, that precious baby that you're holding inside of you that could suddenly kind of, it could come to an end in a way that could be just so awful. And that pain that so many families and parents were going through, and the fact that wasn't really talked about a lot. And so having spoken to Mark about it and having sort of thought through it and thinking to myself, well, look, actually, I've got a platform in the House of Lords. We have this great opportunity where we can propose inquiries of this nature that in a sense you sort of craft the sort of terms of reference, and then you try and then you have to sell it to a rather intimidating sort of group of peers who decide what makes the grade and what doesn't make the grade. And I think that increasingly we're exposing the fact that reproduction, maternity health, health around, why are babies being, why is there still this sort of very high rate of preterm birth or stillbirth in this country and obviously in other countries as well. And it's not being talked about. I mean, arguably, it's one of the most sort of tragic things to happen. And I just felt strongly that we needed to at least give it a go to get an inquiry in place. And so we worked together to sort of put the best facts forward and the most compelling case. And I'm delighted to say that they wanted to do this inquiry, and I was delighted to be part of that journey.
The inquiry itself was extraordinary. I have actually read through most of it this morning. And what do you feel came from it? What are your main takeaways? Because it's extensive. I mean, it's an extraordinary report.
It was, and I can't claim any credit for the report whatsoever because I wasn't allowed. The great irony is if you succeed in getting your sort of your idea accepted, you're then not allowed to sit, you're not allowed to chair the inquiry. You can sit on the inquiry, but I wasn't able to sit on the inquiry because I was doing another big piece of work for the government, so I wasn't able to do both, which was rather sort of sad for me. But having said that, though, it was really well led, and there were so many experts on the inquiry, so that sort of didn't worry me at all. It was brilliantly sort of put together. But I think government-led strategy around this had not been sort of properly sort of thought through. And I think that the long-term impacts of preterm birth hadn't been properly sort of talked about, or 1 in 10 preterm children very often has a learning disability. There was virtually no data around that. There was sort of big failures in follow-up care. There was also obvious sort of postcode lottery in terms of, were you getting the right treatment in the run-up to potentially preventing a preterm birth? The fact that, wider scale prevention is very much sort of under prioritised, and also the research funding gap. And this was one of the things that I think perhaps sort of got the inquiry over the line in the first place, was that when you contrast how much money is being spent on, let's say, heart defects or heart problems, it's absolutely vast compared to what's being spent in this area. And of course, the reasons for that is that there's no real incentive for drug companies to put that research in, because they can't really sell that many drugs to pregnant women, let's face it. So I found that sort of very upsetting and a bit cynical. And so I think that, this is why the government has to do as much as it can in this area.
Did the report come up with any key leading recommendations, do you know?
I mean, let's take them in order. The first recommendation was that the government absolutely should set out its plans to revise the current national maternity safety ambition. And we've seen that, not just in preterm births, we've seen maternal deaths are still really quite high, and obviously, deaths of children. We have stalled in our progress on this, and it feels not the hallmark of a civilized society, really. We should be protecting our mothers going into childbirth, and we should be protecting our babies from not being born preterm. And so that was a sort of a very a big recommendation. The second recommendation, which I think is very important, is that the government should set out how, as part of its strategy for women's health, it will actually ensure that all women have access to information and advice on pregnancy planning and preconception health at an appropriate time. I think, you've obviously got to have the research and the ability to actually sort of prevent a woman who perhaps is very likely to have a preterm birth, but you also need to have the education in the run-up, making sure that women understand, what should be done in advance of pregnancies, and all those sort of other factors that sometimes also do fit into, whether you are, what kind of socioeconomic group you fit into. I think that's another big factor that almost people are too scared to talk about, but actually it really makes a difference. I got to recommendation 3. The government and NHS England must take further action to ensure the consistent implementation of clinical guidance relating to preterm birth, particularly the perinatal optimisation interventions sent out in the Saving Babies' Lives Care Bundle. Every region should have resources to adopt the methodology of implementation programmes that have been shown to be effective and continue to strengthen maternal medicine and neonatal networks. So that is trying to eradicate this postcode lottery, which we know exists, at large still.
Yeah.
Recommendation 4, the point was made that it's imperative that the government and NHS England meet the commitments to develop maternity and neonatal workforce set out in the NHS long-term workforce plan. Recommendation 5 was making the point that NHS England should publish the findings of its maternity and neonatal estate survey, setting out what proportion of neonatal units are currently able to provide sufficient accommodation for all families as per the updated service specification of neonatal critical care. And that is, acknowledging that families are perhaps displaced. There could be sort of huge kind of knock-on effects to families. And I think that's a very important recommendation. The other recommendation 6, sorry, this is a bit of a long list, but I think it's important to talk through each one. The government and NHS England should set out their plans for future investment in parental accommodation on neonatal units to support improvised provision of family integrated care. And I think, again, that feeds into the previous recommendation, where I think sometimes when we talk about these issues, we're not thinking about the real human element to it, that you want to stay you want to stay with your baby. You don't want to have to leave. You know, if it's a preterm baby, and obviously there's going to be long spells potentially in hospital, you want to be able to be close, and that I think also adds to an added problem sometimes around the mother's mental health after the birth, if there's seen to be the ability to keep the mother and baby together and not sort of thought through properly. I mean, I remember a friend of mine had twins, and the twins were separated because the incubators, there was only one incubator in one hospital and one in another. And then there was no place for her to sleep in either hospital. So it was incredibly traumatic every time she had to leave her baby. It's, I can remember just the sort of pain on her face when she was going through this. So I think that's a particularly important recommendation.
And incredibly common, actually. Trying to facilitate very premature babies in incubators is a very real challenge. And I myself, before my eldest was born and at risk of coming early, they very kindly allowed me to look around the NICU, and they very clearly said to me, it is unlikely that if your baby comes early, there will be a place for baby here. We will have to go out of county. It is highly likely that you will have to be miles away. Now, obviously, it doesn't just affect the parent. You've got to imagine that parent might be needing to feed baby or needing to supply baby. It's a very, very, very challenging situation, and it's much more common, I think, than people think.
I think that's right, and I don't think it's spoken about enough, because people, unless you've seen it firsthand, possibly even like a really close friend or a really close family member, because people sort of, people don't necessarily broadcast that they're going through this, and might not necessarily want to talk about it much after the event. So quite often it is a bit of an unspoken thing. This not only have you had this very difficult thing happen in a preterm birth, you then are having to sort of, the fallout afterwards is, again, can be very, very sort of difficult to manage for the whole family as well. And then recommendation 7, the penultimate recommendation, is the government and NHS England should detail the steps they are taking to ensure equitable access to neonatal outreach and perinatal mental health services, which again, it's a sort of feeds into to all those previous recommendations. And then finally, which I think this is incredibly important, NHS England should work with training providers to embed opportunities to develop specialist knowledge of the needs of preterm babies and their families into health visitor training and continuous professional development, making the point that their journey into early childhood and beyond potentially may well be affected by their early arrival into this world. And I think not enough thought has been put into that.
What do you think needs to happen to improve the lives of those affected by it? How can we facilitate that?
Well, look, speaking from sort of personal experience, not having had a preterm child, but the sort of I do think that the care post birth care is something that could be done better. I mean, I remember it, again, it was during COVID, but with my final child, I don't think actually I had an in-person health visitor touch base, which I suppose was fair enough. We were in the throes of COVID, but we then, as we went on, I still never really saw a health visitor, and I could easily have got out of seeing those health visitors, frankly. There was no real sort of desire to follow up on me. Now, I was 3 babies in, I was fairly, I didn't have mental health problems, there was a fairly straightforward situation. But clearly that if you have had that very, very difficult situation, and you need to be looked after much more closely.
Community care is really important, isn't it? It's really important.
And I think there were some very powerful comments that came into that were raised during the debate we had actually when we were talking about the report, was that the impact also on the mother's mental health going forward, because you are a bag of nerves. I mean, not 100%, obviously I'm generalising, but I think the majority of women who've had that sort of run up to having a baby will be more fragile perhaps than if it had been straightforward. I think the impact that has on family life, the impact that has on siblings potentially, the impact that it has on relationships. And look, I know there isn't there's obviously a finite resource. I'm not suggesting that you can achieve things that are just simply, nice to have but impossible. But I do think that sort of general acknowledgement that this is going to be a much harder beginning for these families and for this child, I think would help with outcomes for sure.
Absolutely, and I think I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I myself had a very traumatic experience, and it definitely goes with you, and you carry it with you in every pregnancy. You're absolutely right in getting access and community care, and I appreciate obviously that yours was during COVID. Do we know what that looks like at the moment, the care for women that have been through this experience? Do we know how it's looking at the moment? And has that been, do you think, off the back of this report? I mean, it's quite extensive. I had no idea that it had gone into quite so much detail, I'll be honest. It's really interesting. They've done a very good job.
Yeah, well, these reports are... I mean, I always get, again, just going off subject a bit, but I do, it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, because actually on these committees, and it's, it applies to pretty much any committee I've sat on, they take extensive evidence, it is a very well run piece of work very often. And what is frustrating sometimes is when it sort of gets then handed over to government and they sort of say, oh, thank you very much. We'll have a look at these findings and
tick box.
Yeah. Having said that, though, I think having delivered various reports to the government, the thoughtful, the considered response that the government and the minister at the time gave, I felt was not something they were just trying to kind of dismiss. They didn't give just a one letter response, which sometimes what you can get. It feels like it is, a thought through piece of work that they did, to come back to the recommendations. But I think with everything, there has to be a much better kind of tracking of, well, what is the real progress? And I don't know the answer to that, I'll be honest with you, but I suspect it is the kind of thing that can quite easily fall through the gaps. So it I'm afraid is, it shouldn't fall to charities like Borne, but clearly kind of external voices and external pressures, always keeping this on the agenda, is something that is enormously helpful, which is why, I've agreed to do this podcast, because I think the more we sort of shout about it, the more we say, look, this isn't something that can just be sort of forgotten about and allowed to let slide or stall.
And I think that's what Borne are doing now, or trying to do. They're certainly trying to make waves in that direction. The Borne Collaborative are coming together, and rather than saying this is my work, they're opening everything up with other bodies of research and other charities, so that they can come together.
I think that's really important.
Really important.
Particularly in this space where, I'm not saying it's siloed, but often if you haven't got a sort of an absolute vast amount of money to throw at it, in fact, everyone has to sort of come together and make the voice as loud as possible.
I agree with you. And when I speak about the work that Borne does, and when we are raising money for the charity, I speak from a very personal place. But what I try and do, and what I think you do very eloquently, is I think people misunderstand. When you talk about preterm birth, people look at it and think, well, it is very sad when a baby dies. It's horrific, absolutely horrific. I know this. People often don't know that preterm birth is the leading cause of neonatal morbidity in the UK. What perhaps people don't think of is the inordinate cost of babies and those born with lifelong disabilities. And I'm not reducing any life to a cost, but if that's where people wish to focus and understand why this is so important and so imperative that people, it's not just emotional, it is emotional, but it's very important that people understand there is a very real cost to this. And do you think when you started this inquiry or when you read through this report that people realised that actually the lifelong cost and disabilities and the sort of the whole holistic approach of it, do you think people fully understood and fully understand now why this is so important? It isn't just about babies sadly not making it. It is actually about a very real cost to the UK, to us.
Well, I think that the I think you have to, unfortunately, in politics and when you're making policy decisions, you obviously you need the kind of the reality of how it's affecting people. But introducing policy changes at scale can be very, very expensive. So you're right. There does need to be a sort of in addition to it being the right thing to do, there has to, of course, for it to be a sustainable policy change, to have an economic impact. I mean, I think the thing that also struck me in agreeing, in going into trying to get this report over the line, was that there was always kind of news programmes and wonderful celebration. And by the way, I don't take away from that. It's amazing that we can now keep babies alive from such a young age. But there was a sort of, I felt like the emphasis was very much on the sort of science behind, look, these clever doctors have managed to keep this little mite alive from that age and happy days. But, really there should be as much emphasis put on let's try and keep that baby inside his or her mother's tummy for longer, and that ultimately, as you say, increases their life chances, because there's very little focus on, well, that child did survive from whatever early weeks, but how is he doing in life? Those scientific advances in one area are great, but actually what is happening down the track? And I felt strongly as well that there just wasn't at all a sort of data track of these children who had survived, and how are they doing in life.
I agree with you, actually. I think it's really important to look at the implications and ramifications of that. And I know the report does go into the percentages, and it does go into the lifelong issues that can happen on the back of premature birth. And at Borne, I know that they are trying to do that. They are trying to underline how important the research is on the back of tracking babies that are born too soon. I know you've been an incredible supporter of Borne, and I know that obviously you've mentioned that you had your youngest with Professor Johnson. What part of what Borne are doing interests you the most?
Obviously, all strands of it are important, particularly the research around trying to prevent it in the first place. But that's obviously a big long-term goal, which we all support. But the idea that if you've had a sort of traumatic pregnancy loss, and the fact that you can have your hand held sort of both metaphorically and sometimes literally through the beginning of your pregnancy right to the end, and obviously to the end is just as sort of terrifying as the beginning for so many people. It's just, I think that weight of worry can help so much. It doesn't take the worry away, but it just gives you that enormous support that you need, and you shouldn't have to have, I don't know, a horrendous amount of losses before you get that support, which is, something I really, really wholeheartedly thank Borne for pioneering and for being, spearheading. For me, and for having seen friends go through this and knowing that they could then, that would be a sort of programme that they were then, privy to and able to access, I think makes a huge amount of difference. But I would also add that we have to make sure that this is sort of national. This is not a postcode lottery, because I think we're very we're very, again, politicians as well, we sometimes get completely focused in sort of London or we've got to make sure that we absolutely that women up in Scunthorpe or women, in deepest, darkest Scotland aren't sort of suffering as well, and they get the same kind of care, which I know is not Borne's responsibility. That is a governmental responsibility. And I hope and pray that we are going to get better at that.
And why do you think we're in a situation where, obviously, females have been giving birth as long as time? It is very, very underfunded, very misunderstood. Obviously, Borne and other charities and research bodies are doing their best and making headway slowly but surely. We still can't categorically say why preterm birth happens, and often parents and carers have to walk away from hospitals with very little answers. Why do you think it is still quite underfunded, very underfunded and misunderstood? Why do you think that I always ask this question when people come on the pod, because I find it extraordinary that we are in a situation how we are, given the subject matter. So why do you think it is so underfunded? Why do you think we are in the situation we are?
Well, I think there's a sort of, I guess because it's such a natural thing to do, give birth, there is this sort of, when I was pregnant, that sense that, will you have painkillers? Somehow you are less of a mother if you actually, have an epidural, or you take care that if you can't just sort of give birth naturally in a water pool or at home. There is something around pregnancy that it seems to bring out a kind of, you should be able to do this. And
opinions, it brings out of judgment and opinions.
Exactly right, Caro. It brings out opinions which are very often wholly unwelcome. And so I don't know if that's the reason why people are sort of not as interested in it as they should be. I mean, by the way, I'm not suggesting that the scandals around some of the maternity services that have happened in recent years are not being looked at properly and are not cared about deeply. I'm not sort of being remotely sort of sweeping like that. To the point I made earlier, there's no money to be made in selling drugs to pregnant women.
Pharma.
So you miss out on a lot more big pharma research that may have been going in. I think, I personally think that is a huge shame, and I think that companies could bet, maybe they wouldn't be able to necessarily convert it into drug sales, but you could convert it into a whole host of amazing kind of status and standing for your company if you made that a sort of a particular driver in terms of sort of putting money into researching this, to a bit like Bill Gates with the plans to eradicate polio. Why not? But I think there is a sort of seems to be a inevitability about, childbirth is, it has to be like this, or it should be like that. And of course, sometimes things go wrong. It seems to be just a kind of an acceptance which you wouldn't necessarily accept in any other health setting.
Yeah, we've normalised things that actually are not normal, and we have accepted that it just happens, which is dangerous and unhelpful for maternal health. It's unacceptable, which I think Borne have definitely underlined. Going forward, Gabby, with Borne and with what the government have seen within this report, because I know when you first proposed the inquiry, there was just 2% of the health research budget that went towards reproductive health per annum. I'm thinking that may not have changed hugely at the moment.
I'm a very positive person, and I always think there are always opportunities. So I do think that there is a big opportunity now. There's obviously going to be people, I think, whether you're Labour, Tory, Lib Dems, Greens, whoever, you come into politics, I hope, for the right outcome. You might have a different view of how to do it. But, ultimately, I think if campaigners like Borne and people, politicians like myself, who care about it, if we really set out what the sort of gaps still are, really emphasising, don't assume that that the new people will have read the report, the House of Lords did. I think it has to be distilled down into some very easy to understand, strategic directive points. And I would say that, the lack of national coordination, the persistent inequalities, the weak postnatal support that we've spoken about, and I think all the underfunded research. And I think that all makes up, and, what are we trying to fix with that? We're trying to sort of fix and take away that sort of tragedy that so many women are still going through. And so I think you can always repackage things, even if you've said it already and you feel like you've said it till you're blue in the face. When there's sort of political change, that's another opportunity to really hammer the drum. And I think that, so I would say to, anyone listening to this who cares about this, we should sort of jump on the momentum of a sort of second wave of change, rather than thinking, oh, we've got to explain all this again to a whole new bunch of people. It's actually another opportunity to actually make some headway.
Okay, and that's how it works. That's really interesting, actually, because I think a lot of people wouldn't know.
You have to sort of re-explain it again and again. Quite often, there's a lot of churn in the officials. There's obviously a lot of churn, a suboptimal amount of churn in the ministers, and you do have to try and persuade that new person in place that this is the thing that they can actually, really kind of make a name for themselves in, which again is I certainly believe that this is if I was sort of a minister in the Ministry of Health, this is the Ministry of Health, so I'm going back about 100 years, you know what I mean? I would want to get on this bandwagon, because I think there are not many more emotive things to talk about, really.
And also there aren't, and we do labour this point on the pod, there are very few people unaffected by this. When you take it right back and you talk about it in an educational setting, personally, my view is this maternal health and birth should be weaved into education. Because there are so many people that will be impacted.
It's probably not just the Department of Health that could be spoken to about this. I think definitely the Department of Education is another area that probably shouldn't be missed off the list.
It certainly crosses over, doesn't it? So you started supporting Borne when you met Mark, is that right?
Well, yes and no. So I, a dear friend of mine, before I knew them, had experienced a loss, and I can remember kind of hearing about their loss and thinking about their loss, when it became apparent that this had happened to them after I'd got to know them. And I just, a couple of things that they said just really sort of, feel sort of, and obviously I know you've experienced loss as well, and I just think it's your worst nightmare. There you are, you're supposedly welcoming a baby in, and in fact the curtains remain closed, and and people don't know what to do. I imagine people don't know how to help you or even what to say, and I suspect people would, and I've experienced grief at in various other sudden shocking grief, and people almost walk away from you because they just don't know how to handle your pain, and it's a reflection on them. But and we've all probably done it a bit, thinking, crikey, I should have written that note to someone, but I didn't, because I didn't quite know what to say. And so that just really, I just can remember thinking, wow, that's about as hard as it gets. The loss of a child is as hard as it gets.
And that's when you first found out or had interaction with Prof?
Yes,
was it?
Yeah. And I remember going to an amazing sort of gathering of experts and people who had been affected, and a pulling together of people who really cared. And it really struck me what a powerful, amazing organisation it was, because it was, again, people who were so grateful to this organisation that was actually sort of trying to do something to prevent people from going through that same pain, or help them get to the end of a pregnancy. yes, like I said, I haven't experienced it myself, but having seen it through friends, and as you say, it's really common. It's really common.
Terrifyingly so. And actually, I have to say, with with Mark Johnson, he is exceptional. And I always sort of express the line, he's the guy that doesn't leave. You know, he stayed in hospital with me for, I think it was 4 straight days while I was in the ICU. He's an extraordinary human being. And I think everybody that meets him knows that when you invest time and finance within this charity, he will make sure that it is money and time well spent, because he is an exceptional human being. So it's just very interesting to know your link to him, and so many people are linked to him and via him.
And I know people are so grateful, and I think if we could get to a stage where we could sort of I'm semi-joking, clone him. But
we don't joke about it. We call it a virtual Mark Johnson. That's what we need, a virtual Mark Johnson. If AI was ever going to be put to good use.
Well, that's what we should work on. Yeah, exactly. An AI model that can sort of create. But I mean, obviously, we in reality, though, we need so much. We need lots and lots of obstetricians who, you know, understand and have that same sort of depth of knowledge as Professor Mark Johnson.
Well, I think that's as well what Borne are trying to do, sort of pool all these resources and bring in someone as an incredible brain within this field as Prof. Mark Johnson, so that people everywhere have this access, internationally speaking. I mean, he's often in different countries doing research there and bringing that back here so that they can benefit, so that everybody can benefit. And I think that's the very real draw of him. And I don't know if you found that as well. And I expect that his incredible passion for what he does fed into yourself, which is why we are reading this report, you know, and that is community.
No, I think it's a very good point, actually. It's a very good point. And I felt also that, you know, again, coming back to, sorry to repeat myself, but coming back to the sort of regional point, is it's every trust should have a sort of a centre of excellence, you know, like we have more of, let's say, in London or the main cities. You know, there should be like, okay, I would ideally like nobody ever to actually lose a baby. You should be there should be an ability to see factors before a baby is lost. But heavens, if you have lost a baby, you know, very far down the track, you must immediately be able to get access to a sort of, you know, a different kind of care that really does acknowledge all the things that you're going through, as well as medically trying to get you to that end point.
Yeah, it's multifaceted, isn't it? It's about getting those people where they need to be and getting the support that is required. And we can only hope that reports like this, that some good and something comes from that. I mean, it's an incredible, I mean, the actual name of it, the preterm birth, reducing risks and improving lives, is, you know, it's a perfect description of what it was trying and what it will hopefully continue to do. Gabby, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So eloquent and so brilliant. And also thank you for bringing this to the forefront. I think it's incredibly important and speaks volumes that we have this. I think it's really something that could hopefully help many, many people. And it's such a shame it wasn't done previously, but we have it now. And I really hope some good comes from it. And thank you for...
Well, no, thank you for having me. And I think, like I said, I'd just end on the note that we mustn't stop beating the drum about it. So the report has been done. It's been done brilliantly by colleagues like Baroness Wild in the House of Lords. And I think that, you know, collectively there are a group of us and, you know, campaigners who really care about this. And we must just... you know, the various changes that may be afoot, we absolutely use it as another reason to go in and demand meetings and demand progress and you know, where are we actually getting to on this? And so I think it's very much a sort of the report's been done and it's been done really well, but now the sort of work in some ways starts now to make sure that it's actually put into practice and makes a difference.
And we can just keep going back and banging that drum.
Exactly.
Thank you very, very much for your expertise on this, Gabby. I really appreciate your time today.
No, thanks for having me.
For more information on the work of the Borne Foundation and how you can help the charity save babies' lives, please visit www.borne.org.uk or follow the links in the podcast notes. The Borne Podcast is presented by Ellie Gibson, Caro and Professor Mark Johnson. The music is by Kirsty Newton and it is produced by Laura Grimshaw.